Welcome to episode 6 of The Culinary Citizen, a gastronomic guide to international relations. This is Sam Chappell-Sokol.
And Kelsey Marr. Each week we introduce you to a concept or theme connecting food and people around the world. This week, we'd like to welcome Dr. Johanna Mendelsohn-Forman, a scholar-in-residence at American University and a senior advisor at the Stimson Center. Hi, Dr. Forman.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
We're so happy that you're here with us. Just a little background and bio about Johanna. She's had an amazing career working on security issues, post-conflict reconstruction, and renewable energy in Latin America mostly, having spent time at a number of impressive organizations. Besides her work at the Stimson Center, she's worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the World Bank, and various branches of the U.S. government and USIP, for example. She has always been interested in food and food studies and recently turned her attention to incorporating the culinary world into that of conflict resolution with the creation of the Conflict Cuisines course at American University. This class, which launched in 2014 for seniors at AU's School of International Service, teaches students about Cold War conflicts that initiated waves of migration, specifically to the D.C. area. The students learn about the history and context of the conflict, and then have a chance to meet a chef or restaurateur who is part of the diaspora and taste their food, a visceral way to connect across cultures and borders. I had the opportunity to work with Johanna on the first iteration of the course, and today we have her on The Culinary Citizen to discuss how the class is going, the idea of conflict cuisines in a broader sense, and what other projects she has in mind. Kelsey, take it away.
Wow, that sounds like an impressive resume. We've mentioned your work before on a few times on this program, and it's so great that you're able to join us. So let's first begin with what is conflict cuisine and what it is not.
Well, that's a good question. And when we started, as Sam can tell you, we were actually trying to make that definition clear. But for me, conflict cuisine really has two forms. First, it's food in the zones of conflict. That's a phenomenon that encompasses access to food, food security, and impact in the field of fighting on existing food supply. And the second form of conflict cuisine is the food of the diasporas, which you mentioned in your introduction, and how they transfer those national foodways to new countries as an extension of their culture.
How does one identify the conflict cuisine in their neighborhood?
Well, as we know, there are many conflicts going on in the world. They didn't start in the 21st century. They started all over history. But in the United States, to be specific, after the Second World War, many diasporas of countries that were at war with the United States, such as Vietnam, Korea, eventually Afghanistan, Ethiopia, all of these countries that were proxies in Cold Wars, became part of the diaspora that came to the United States. And what's interesting is many conflict cuisines that come to the United States come through our refugee resettlement program, which has been in the news lately in the case of the Syrian refugees. So, people think that conflict cuisines only exist in urban areas, but that's not true. There are 20 cities in the United States that are chosen by the Department of Health and Human Services where immigrants reintegrate. Mm-hmm. In the Washington area, we have a very unique situation because there was an idea that you could always tell where the United States was at war by the new restaurants that opened. And in the 1980s, we had a congressman who later became a senator who once said, "I wish that the Russians would send tanks down the Champs-Élysées so we would be able to get a decent French restaurant." But what it was really the fact that people who come from other countries usually use food as a means of creating a livelihood, of spreading their culture, and integrating new food ways into a city.
Do you know what the elements are that make these cities one of the drop-off zones for refugees?
Well, as I mentioned, there are specific cities that the U.S. government picks. But in addition, Washington was the nation's capital. So, for example, the Vietnamese that came here in 1975 after the fall of Saigon were mainly from the South. Many of them were Army officers or people related to working with the U.S. government in that wave of refugees. And they came here because the United States and many of the people in Washington had ties to the former government in Vietnam that had fallen when the communists invaded. Similarly, in Afghanistan in 1979, we became a place of asylum for those people fleeing the Russians who invaded in 1979, and you got many diplomats who would come here and settle. In Ethiopia, it's a different story because the ongoing civil war that started after the deposition of Haile Selassie and continued through the 90s brought waves and waves of Ethiopians. In fact, Washington has the largest concentration of Ethiopians outside of Addis Ababa. They have about 250,000 who live just in Washington alone.
Wow.
But the Ethiopian population all over the United States is spreading, as I can talk about later. And then, of course, Central American civil wars had their own diaspora, and Washington again became the home of many of those individuals from Central America, particularly El Salvador. We have a very large population. I think after Los Angeles, we're the second largest. Guatemalans came here, Nicaraguans came here. So we began to get all of the relatives, legal and illegal, that began to flow here because of the horror of wars that they were experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a question for you about the first country you mentioned, and I was listening to the Kojo Namdi show on WAMU a couple days ago and heard you speaking with Kojo and a couple other folks. You talked about the Eden Center in Northern Virginia. Can you tell us more about that area and how that has become a space for Vietnamese immigrants to find a cultural center, and how cuisine fits into that space?
Well, the Eden Center, which was formed, I guess, after the Vietnamese refugees came here, they began filling up stores along a street called Wilson Boulevard. And eventually that settlement became so large that they needed a shopping center. And that shopping center became a little Vietnam. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is even today in 2015, they fly the flag of the Republic of South Vietnam in the parking lot and not the flag of the country of Vietnam. So you can tell loyalties. And ironically, across the street in another shopping mall is the Northern Vietnamese cuisine restaurant. But the Eden Center really reflects, I think, what we talk about in terms of conflict cuisines. Many regions of the country are represented, many types of cuisines. There's one store dedicated to banh mi, another dedicated to tofu. There's one dedicated to pastry. And inside the mall are all these little shops that resemble market stalls inside the markets in Vietnam, where you can find an accountant, where you can find a travel agent, you can find a hairdresser, a nail salon. So it really becomes a beehive in many respects for people coming from all over the region who want to stock up on supplies, eat the cuisine of their home, and do more. But as you asked, Sam, one of the interesting things is now it's over 40 years, in some cases 50 years, that we've had Vietnamese come to the United States. And what you're dealing with is second-generation store owners. What does this mean? The success of the Vietnamese population has led to the children owning the restaurants but not wanting to be cooks. And one of the phenomena here is that the cooks in many Vietnamese restaurants in the Eden Center are now Honduran. And for some reason, that nationality from Central America has taken up the mantle of becoming great Vietnamese cooks. So you really have fusion cuisine.
I've had the same experience at there's one of my favorite Eritrean restaurants in D.C. is called Karen at 18th in California, and I asked the owner, who was Eritrean, about who was actually cooking in the back, and they said that there were a couple of Salvadoran cooks and a couple of Honduran cooks who had learned the cuisine to a T, which is a really interesting question connected to another guest that you had with you on the Kojo show, as well as a spokesperson. One of the speakers we had in the class was Mariano Ramos. Right. Exactly. Chef Ramos spoke to the class. He did some cooking demonstrations. Can you tell us a little bit about his story and his role at the Carlos Rosario School in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I think, as we know, food is a way that people can communicate without necessarily speaking the language. And Mariano Ramos is a first-generation Mexican-American. He's also been a chef in some very well-known establishments that are on the 100 best restaurant lists from the Little Washington to Central. But he also has a real passion for teaching others about food. And what he has demonstrated by teaching in a charter school that helps people get their general education degrees, many people of them are refugees or asylees, is that you can do a lot by using food to get different groups to talk to one another. Mm-hmm. And he serves as a interlocutor in many ways between the African students and the Central American students and the Asian students and the Filipinas who come in, because everybody can speak the language of food. And I would say that immigrants serve as culinary diplomats. We don't think of them that way, but just the way we have the high level diplomacy that Sam, you've written about, we also have the diplomacy of individuals who use their food to communicate with other people.
Exactly. How did you become interested in conflict cuisine?
Well, I think it was a process that happened very quickly, and probably Sam was involved in that process. I was listening to some discussions at the State Department about culinary diplomacy, and then I met one of the people you interviewed, Paul Rockauer, who was a person in public diplomacy who focused on gastro diplomacy. And there was a panel at American University in actually 2013, Sam, I think this was, that featured Sam and this colleague, Paul Rockauer, and they talked about the use of food in different ways that I thought were all related to the international relation concept of soft power. I said, isn't this brilliant? Food can be a way of a country projecting its power. And as I sat and listened to this conference, I said, I could build a course around that. We have all these different food establishments of different nationalities, and we have all these conflicts going on in the world. And as you mentioned, I teach and have taught often about nation building and rebuilding after war. And I said, wouldn't it be interesting to use personal stories of the people who've actually left war zones as a vehicle to discuss food security, culinary diplomacy, and also to teach the students about the impact that becoming a citizen of a new country has and the role that food can play in integration into a new land.
I'm curious about, to go back to your first definition about conflict cuisine, how it has two facets. One is food and food security in zones of conflict. Other is food in diasporas. How are those two facets of this idea related between eating in country in a conflict situation and creating a sense of community in a diaspora situation? How are those related under the same umbrella?
Well, I believe that people who are coming from conflict zones carry with them their own stories. Often they're very tragic stories, but they also relate to the fact that war devastates a country that's weak, something that we call fragile states, often loses its infrastructure very quickly because institutions disappear. And so often people who come here as immigrants or refugees, even if they're economic immigrants, can't get enough food in their own country and come here to try and find a new life, which also means a more secure food basis. Then I think you have the conflict cuisine dimension of the diaspora, and immigrants, as I say, are culinary diplomats, and their cooking is a way of transferring elements of their own culinary cultures to diverse communities. And with 60 million refugees wandering the globe right now, which is a tragedy, you understand the connection between immigration, conflict, and people settling in new lands and carrying their food as a way to connect them. And I just like to add one other point, that often what people have that remains is only their food waste. They don't have anything else. And so when they eat their food, they're really not able to be in their home, but they have a taste of their homeland. And this taste memory is very, very important in building communities up again.
Yeah, I think it was a quote that you told me, I forget who actually said it, was about how language might be one of the first generation or second generation cultural markers to leave, whereas food lasts generations.
I mean, that's correct. And you see that over and over again. I actually found the source of that. I don't have it at my fingertips, but it's true that you can, especially at the holiday times, people will talk about their aunt's pierogi, for example, a Polish dumpling, and they may not speak a word of Polish, but they know that their grandmother or their great-grandmother made this dish, and the taste of that brings them back to their origins, to their roots.
I'd like to go into a little bit of different direction, talking about the conflict zones that we've been discussing and where refugees are coming from, but how can food actually cause conflict? We talk a lot about conflict resolution through food and community building through food, but in which settings does food or culinary nation branding, we can get into that second, but how can food cause conflict?
Well, I think there's been a lot of emphasis in recent years, particularly since the Arab Spring began, on taking a look at the impact of high food prices, climate change, which created droughts, particularly in Syria and other parts of the Middle East, and the impact that these high prices had on unrest. People, for example, protest the price of rice and beans and grains. The other issue that happened is as the global price for corn increased because of the increased use of corn for renewable energy, not that I think that that was the cause itself, also created greater sense of awareness that you were very connected to the land and the food that you ate. So, food is a driver of conflict in the sense that where you have food shocks, where you have immediate high prices because of environmental issues or because of changes in the market, you also have the potential for conflict in countries which don't have social safety nets. Mm-hmm. And many of the countries that are in conflict right now lack the basic safety nets that we expect in a developed world. And that's the greatest challenge we face. How do you protect people when there's a drought? How do you protect people when there's a plague in the country? Look at what Ebola did in West Africa. We solved one problem. We staunched the epidemic, but we created a food crisis because people couldn't travel and couldn't bring food from the into the market.
Yeah, I remember reading in your 2014 article entitled Conflict Cuisine, Teaching War Through Washington's Ethnic Restaurant Scene in the Public Diplomacy magazine, you talk about the role of women and the gendered nature of food in conflict. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, we know that 60% of the world's farmers are women. Some people say it's 70%. I will use the 60% figure. When you have a war going on and you have landmines that are planted in your field that you haven't done, it stops agriculture. When you have people who lose their crops because of fighting, because there is no access to seed, you then have a dramatic problem. Women usually remain behind in villages, and women are not able to farm when there's active fighting going on. Mm-hmm. Also, women are responsible for the cooking and for finding, products that can keep people alive. And yet, when you have no infrastructure or services, yet they become the main victims. Look at the people who are fleeing right now out of Syria. Most of the victims there are women and children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, similarly, women's roles in the nation branding aspect of culinary diplomacy. I'm following the UNESCO Intangible Heritage List, and recently Mexico was awarded on the list for their role of women in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the food conflict nation branding causes?
Well, another example, Mexico is an excellent example of the way that the government has taken its cuisine. I think Mexico and Peru, both of which have been given the UNESCO Intangible Heritage Award, represent very original cuisines of the Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. The use of women in Mexico in both agriculture, which is quite high in the rural areas, but also as cooks, is a recognition of the integral role that women have played in the kitchens in Mexico, from making the tortillas to grinding the corn to actually creating the food that is served on the table. And this goes back to pre-Columbian times. But in terms of how it relates to conflict, I think Peru is a better example. Mm. And the reason I say Peru is that in the 1990s, Peru was plagued by a horrible internal guerrilla war with the Sendero Luminoso, this group that was essentially, I guess, the ISIL of South America, although they didn't behead people the way ISIL did. Mm. And this group caused tremendous terror and hardship in the country. Eventually, people rebelled, and they blocked off routes into the city, and the farmers themselves created these peasant round tables, and they were the ones who protected communities against the Sendero. Now, what does this mean in terms of food? Peru had a bad reputation. It was a country that people thought of and didn't go to visit, even though it has great archaeological ruins. And food culture became something that was used as the conflict ended to become the new symbol of stability. And one chef in particular, Gaston Acuria, started opening restaurants which not only trained young Peruvians, and he took many of these kids from the slums and taught them to be chefs, but also used the indigenous cuisine as a way to fuse it with the Western cuisine and create a uniquely Peruvian taste. And now that, of course, is very much a part of the history of Peru, and they brand themselves as a culinary destination.
There's actually a gastronomic tourism board. It's a private-public partnership that was anointed in March of this year, or appointed in March of this year. And I think that we're going to have a representative from that board on the show in the next couple of months. So we'll learn more about Peruvian culinary nation branding, Peruvian gastrodiplomacy at that time.
And Washington is getting a Astridi Gaston restaurant.
Oh, is it Lamar? Is it that theme?
No, I think it's going to be the old one, but okay. That's okay.
That'll be great. There's an interesting story about conflict and cuisine that just came up, and the UNESCO list, I guess. So for the past few years, South Korea has had kimchi recognized as intangible cultural heritage on the UNESCO list. And in the past month or so, North Korea had been pushing for the same recognition. And I think for years, North Korea has been pushing. In the past month or so, UNESCO actually named North Korean kimchi preparation also to that list of intangible cultural heritage. So they're trying to be political and balance the culinary diplomacy. They're trying to balance the recognitions that they're doling out. And I think Peru is still working to get on that list. I don't think they're on that list, and they had an application rejected a couple of years ago. So we'll see if they make it onto that list. I'm sure they will in the next year or two.
Although one could comment that North Korea getting on a culinary diplomacy designation is really ironic, because we know that withholding of food from a population is also considered a war crime. Right. And North Korea has a reputation over its history as a dictatorship, a Stalinist-type dictatorship, to have been very integrally related to withholding food from its population. So we'll see where that goes, but it is, I guess, the irony of all of these types of multilateral organizations that need to, placate the membership.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a brief description of your seminar that you teach at American University?
Well, over 14 weeks, it's hard to convey everything about food security, conflict cuisine. But sure. What I like to do is to start with, getting students to focus on where conflicts are, whether they themselves have had any experience. And then we go through the different types of phenomena related to food and war. We talk about immigrants as culinary diplomats. We talk about gastrodiplomacy, which Sam has written about, and his friend Paul Rockauer, the use of immigrant food in different communities around the world, and how that conveys different types of integration, and it is a way of communicating in it all in it of itself. But I think there's also an interesting phenomena about food that we deal with, and that's food as a tool of peace building. Mm. And we use examples from groups. One that comes to mind is Slim Peace, a group that started during the Intifada in Israel that tried to get Palestinian women and Israeli women to concentrate on how they would create a better diet to lose weight. And it actually had a tremendous confidence building result, which is now being used in the United States to deal with communities where you have recently arrived immigrants who need to integrate. There's a program in Portland, Maine. There's another program in Chicago, and they use Arab nutritionists, and they use Anglo nutritionists, and they work with the groups together. There's another interesting group as well that I've been talking to, which is the Armenian Turkish group in the Caucasus, where a group was trying to demonstrate that women from one side of the border in Armenia cook the same food as women in Turkey. Mm-hmm. And this was also very powerful in demonstrating to women who thought that they were dealing with enemies because of the nationality. In fact, discovered that they cooked the identical food. They just had different names for it. So food has this power of building community, and it also has the power, I think, of reinforcing identity in a way that is positive rather than negative.
What do you hope your students gain from this course, and through what projects to facilitate that learning?
Well, I think students, first of all, like to eat. And one of the things that this class offers, as anybody in college knows, is an opportunity to eat in restaurants where the cuisines are very different than anything they've ever sampled. But to be more serious about it, they begin to understand that food is a complex issue, that it's related to the climate, that it's related to national security, that it's related to building communities, that it has an impact on urbanization. They get a sense of the refugee experience, and they get a sense of what immigrants do in order to survive. So I think they come away with a very diverse set of what I would say interdisciplinary understanding of the food culture. This year, in the past, well, I would start with in the past, we had students seek out restaurants of conflict countries and then interview the owners and find out more about their backgrounds, how they got here, and what they thought they were doing with food. But what I think is interesting this year, and Sam, you will like to know this, is I've taken the, quote, harmonized list of fragile state situations, of which there are about 43 countries in that particular category, and we take advantage of being in Washington because every one of these countries has an embassy here. And this year, students are going to be asked to interview somebody from the embassy who has some role in either agricultural policy or general policy and find out about the food security situation in that country and write a report. But then the other thing I'm going to ask them to do is to see if there are groups that have restaurants from that culture and are serving food here. And often you can find that even if there isn't a restaurant, there's a community center or a church group or a mosque that is serving the food. And so they're going to have to be sleuthing around to find out how food from that particular conflict country helps people survive when they come to this country. So that will be a different approach. And I hope that students will learn about the complexities of the conflict cuisines that they're asked to study.
That's fascinating. And it brings together the two sides that we've been discussing, the two facets of this field, because we're talking about zones of conflict or at least fragile states and the agricultural, the food security situation in those countries, as well as in the diaspora communities, what's going on the ground in order around food.
Right. And I think it's interesting because every single one of these countries has a representative here. And I don't know if you recall, Sam, and you may have been with us when we had the students who interviewed the Sierra Leone political attaché. But in fact, they learned more in that interview about what the foodways were in a country that had been afflicted by conflict than anything else that they had in their experience, because they actually got to talk to someone who had been on the ground, who had lived through that experience, but also understood the challenges of what it's like when you have a war to feed a population.
Right. Right. And to bring out more of those conversations, I think the first year of projects was really fascinating to hear about the cuisines and about the points of view of the chefs, but we didn't get to hear that, policy side.
And you know, as you teach, you learn and you modify. I'm also planning a class next year, which is a graduate course on food security. But for that, I'm going to see if in the 20 cities that refugees are reintegrated into, what impact food has in those reintegration programs. That is, how many of the people reintegrated actually go into the food industry or related industries? Because I suspect it's going to be very high.
That connects to an episode we did a couple shows back with Adam Sudman, who has this pop-up concept called My Lucky Tummy up in Syracuse, New York. I've continued chatting with him, and he has this, it's a pop-up food court that features foods from refugee communities, and each of these are not necessarily professional chefs, but there's some chefs who may want to be getting into the food space, into catering or into restaurants, and he's actually developing an incubating kitchen in order to help them, help entrepreneurs from the refugee communities start their own restaurant. So definitely you should be in touch with Adam and chat with him about that project.
And I think that one of the interesting things in the times that we live in is that these conflict cuisines may actually be very good ways to begin to think about dialogues on identity. And ethnic restaurants are important for the very reason that we're all willing to go in to try an ethnic food. We're willing to try a Burmese food. We're willing to try a Vietnamese food. We trust the chefs. We put the food in our mouth. And yet all of this hatred that we are hearing in the media, that is anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, doesn't coincide with our actual behavior. We certainly will continue to eat the food. We'll certainly go and visit other places that we thought we would never visit. And if you look at the course of history, you have similar types of rejections of different groups, like the Vietnamese, or even certain other communities from Ethiopia. You get the polling data which people says we're not interested in dealing with foreigners, and yet the first thing they'll do is go to a restaurant. And I think in the West Coast, in San Francisco, you had a similar situation with Chinese. I mean, many of the dishes that were invented, the chop suey, some of the kinds of what we consider the typical Chinese plates, were in fact hybrids of cuisine invented for businessmen to have quick lunch in downtown San Francisco.
Right. So I just watched that documentary, Searching for General Tso, which is
on Netflix.
On Netflix, yeah, it's a really interesting, fun look, but also with some deeper meaning behind. It's just this one Chinese American dish, actually Taiwanese American, I think they discover, but it mines the whole depth of the immigrant experience, especially the Chinese immigrant experience in San Francisco and throughout the United States. So
right, and the Chinese immigrants who are been here for a long time have written a lot about that, particularly in the more recent generations who, explain that there isn't such a thing as Chinese food. There's regional food. And I guess the question we have to ask is how these conflict cuisines become localized. Because I argued, and Kelsey, you referenced that article I wrote when I first started, the hope was that the kind of course I did could be done in any community around the United States, because it's not only the big urban centers that have immigrants and refugees, but all of these smaller secondary cities where you can always find a Mexican restaurant or a Chinese restaurant. And I'm always amazed. I was recently in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is one of the reintegration centers. There are 1,000 Yazidis who live there. So there are Yazidi restaurants. There are Ethiopian restaurants. There are Korean people who live there. If you drive through a town, which doesn't have a large population, it's only about 225,000 people, it is a cafeteria of different cuisines. And that is something you would not expect to find in the prairie among Cornhuskers.
Right. I mean, I have a similar question to that. I grew up in a very small southern rural town, and I can remember my family is from the north, and so we would regularly eat pierogis, and then I would, during sleepovers, try to share these pierogis with my friends, and they'd be like, what's this? So how can our listeners use themes of conflict cuisine to create dialogues in their own communities to address perhaps xenophobia that may exist, or fear about refugees or immigrants who may not be present in those communities?
Well, I think all of us who are interested in food and all the people you've mentioned should focus on creating a national dialogue day to help better understand what is going on about identities, because we all come from somewhere else and we all bring with us different food. And we do know that food creates community, particularly Arab cultures who think food is a part of the whole communal experience. And, we should be using these experiences to begin to talk frankly with our friends and neighbors. And it doesn't have to include immigrants to start if you're frightened, to have a dialogue about who we are and do it over food, break bread, talk about what it means to come from another place, because we all did. And it begins to humanize people that are being vilified. We all have to survive, and we all have to, understand each other. And I don't mean, sitting around a table and singing Kumbaya. I mean serious discussions about what it means to be an American, because we all are from different parts of the world.
Right. So how can our listeners become more conscious consumers of conflict cuisine?
Well, I think one thing to do is perhaps for people who are not in big cities is to begin to see where new restaurants are popping up. There are loads of food blogs. You have some of them. For example, Tyler Cowan, who we know from George Mason University and runs a very good one, has documented that Uyghurs from China have opened up restaurants in Arlington County, Virginia.
Hmm.
You can
Okay.
also look at the diversity that's happening in the Ethiopian community, as there are now halal Ethiopian restaurants and
Hmm.
non-halal Ethiopian restaurants, which shows the growing number of Muslim Ethiopians versus Christian Ethiopians that are beginning to come into the United States and open up stores. So I think it's a little sleuth work on the one hand,
Mm-hmm.
but I also would love to see us create a hashtag around national
Mm.
a national identity. And, feeding national identity might be one way, but I think as a community of people concerned with food and interested in the way food serves as a tool for livelihood, for integration, and for maintaining one's identity, but also integrating into a new society, there are many opportunities. And I think that we should start as soon as possible to launch a movement that uses these as a way to dispel some of the ugliness and hatred that we hear every day about people who are not us. Well, who are we? We are
Mm-hmm.
everybody. We are the world in many ways.
I think that's a fabulous idea to create a hashtag. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I started one, a national dialogue on identity, but I think we could come up with more clever ones like feeding identity,
Mm.
and get ethnic restaurants to do a day where they would open their doors and have a conversation. But I think we'd have to do a study guide. I think we'd have to have questions. I've been working with a minister at our local church here who approached me when he read an article I wrote. And I think every institution that brings people together might want to offer a dinner. This is the time of the year to do it. People are looking at a season where we hope for peace. We're looking at a season where families get together. I don't want to take up the Thanksgiving Day because that has special meaning, but we could in the next month or in the new year start a food dialogue with ethnic restaurants. And maybe you guys can start it with your podcast.
That
Great
would be
idea. Yeah,
great.
we'll definitely get this out on our social media channels and figure out how to make that kind of thing happen. Besides the kind of a feeding identity type of project, what else are you working on right now, Johanna? What can we expect from you in the coming months?
Well, I just sat down with some people about creating a task force about food security and mapping what we know and what we don't know, because I think that's really important. And I also still like to follow through on a proposal that you and I discussed about using culinary diplomacy, something that you're an expert in, as a way to build on the history of international relations. As I was telling Kelsey before we went on the air, that just talking to anybody who's been a former ambassador or someone who served in a foreign country always has an interesting food story or a story about the way food had a impact on some project they were working on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Mhm.
our job should be to collect those and to archive those, because you can't take food for granted.
Yeah, that sounds great. So, Johanna, what is your universal truth about food?
I think that my universal truth is that food is something that gives everybody pleasure and is part of our humanity. And it's also obviously a part of our identity and a part of the need to survive. And as someone pointed out, the first thing we do when we're born is we eat. We suckle from our mother's breasts, and that food is so basic that we need to look at it as not only something that nourishes us, but has a history and a role to play in the relationships throughout the world.
Hmm. That's great. Thank you, Johanna. For our listeners, how can they follow you? Where can they learn more about all of these upcoming projects? Where can they see this hashtag?
Well, I do have a website, conflictcuisine.com, and it's being right now in the process of being updated. And I use the hashtag conflict cuisine when I see something. In fact, I just saw an article in the Christian Science Monitor on how one woman in Lebanon was feeding Syrian families, and they used soup and created a recipe book for soup. So I sent that to you. I used your hashtag, Sam. But I think we have to monitor these articles and collect them, and not randomly, but to really categorize them so people get the benefit of how much is going on in the world.
Hmm. I do feel like Twitter is sometimes a little bit random, and I see a lot of articles, I put them on there, so it's a great resource library to look back at, but it's not categorized. And I do feel like it's very important to bring that all into one space together.
And I think this recent article about what one woman was doing in Lebanon for Syrian refugees probably is duplicated around the world. Just the way, the World Food Program has this voucher chef, which is a very optimistic program about refugees using their vouchers. The reality is that food vouchers are really declining because of donations to food security programs. And that is one of the reasons people are fleeing. But nevertheless, collecting these stories and categorizing them by food from different conflict zones and food in the United States where people are creating new food cultures and food ways could also be consolidated with food dialogues.
Yes, that's all of our projects, and we look forward to continuing to work on that. Well, Johanna, thank you so much for joining us this week. We look forward to seeing everything that comes out of Conflict Cuisine, the class, the website, the hashtag, all of these things. We look forward to following your work and working with you in the future.
Well, it's a great partnership, and Kelsey and Sam, as always, thank you for having me on, and I look forward to hearing more of your podcasts.
Sounds good. Thanks, Johanna.
Thank you so much, Johanna.
Thank you for listening to The Culinary Citizen. If you'd like to reach out to us with any questions, any concerns, any thoughts for future episodes, you can email us at culinarycitizen@gmail.com, or you can find us on Facebook /The Culinary Citizen, or look up either of us on Twitter. I'm at Culinary Diplo, not the musician Diplo, the Culinary Diplo, and Kelsey is Kelsey J. Maher, Maher. Johanna, by the way, is Johanna Wonk, JohannAWonk on Twitter. Thank you again, and we look forward to speaking to you next week.